Welcome to everyone who's joined us so far. We have a few virtual meeting tips on the screen. On the left-hand side, you'll see those tips. If you have any questions for today's program, please submit them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can use the chat in the bottom of the Zoom screen for comments and conversations. And if you are having any technical issues, please let us know in the chat and we will do our best to assist you. On the right-hand side, you'll see some new things at Nursing Home 411. We have our new senior care policy briefing, which is a bi-monthly briefing, comes out every 2 weeks. The latest one is called Industry Profits and Payouts Belie Claims of Low Margins. And that's a really interesting newsletter. You can find that on our website. Also on the right-hand side there, you'll see a QR code. Make sure that you're signed up to receive all of the alerts from LTCCC. And then below, we have a new fact sheet. This is on tips for providing input on your nursing home staffing assessment. And this is really good information for family members and residents to discuss with your nursing home, the staffing issues that are going on, and making sure that your input is valued by the nursing home. We have our latest staffing report out. It's on the Q4 2023, shows widespread understaffing, which is, as you all know, not new information, but new data is out there, so you can check that out on our website. And then again, at the bottom, the new federal nursing home staffing standard that came out in about a month ago now, we put together a short brief just on information that you need to know about that staffing standard. So be sure to check that out on our website as well. For materials for today's webinar, you can find that on our website. We will post a recording of today's program by the end of the week, so you can find that there. I'm going to go to the next slide. We are on Instagram. I know we've mentioned this a few times, so thank you for those who have already followed us, but please give us a follow on Instagram. We try to keep it updated with just new information that we're putting out, new briefs, new alerts, new data, stuff like that. So make sure to give us a follow. And you can find us. I think our handle is LTC Consumer. I'll have to double check that and I'll put it in the chat, but make sure to give us a follow on Instagram. Okay, and it is 1:02, so I am going to get us started. My name is Haley Cronquist. I'm the policy attorney at LTCCC. I have been here about 4 years, and I really enjoy this work. So I am going to get us started. LTCCC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to improving care and quality of life for the elderly and adult disabled in long-term care. We do this through policy research and analysis, systems advocacy, public education, and we're also lucky to be the home of 2 local LTC ombudsman programs. And we really value their input and their work. They are really boots on the ground, and we appreciate everything that they do. So today's program, we are lucky to have MT Connolly. She's the author of The Measure of Our Age. It's a book on navigating care, safety, money, and meaning later in life. She drew from personal anecdotes and extensive research, and her book offers a guiding light for individuals seeking to embrace the fullness of life in their later years. So we are really excited for today's program. It's going to be a little bit different than our other webinars. Normally we have, kind of a PowerPoint presentation and that thing, but today we are going to do a little bit more conversational Q&A, and thank you to all of you who submitted questions for today's author. We're looking forward to getting started. So here's just an image of her book. You can find it online. You can use that QR code to find her book if you haven't already read it. It's really, it resonates with a lot of things I'm sure that that people on today's webinar deal with every day, and maybe in their own lives or helping with an aging loved one. So make sure to check out her book if you haven't already. Okay, and I'm going to stop share until the end. Let's see here, and let me just pull up my notes. Okay, So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And MT, welcome to LTCCC's webinar. We're really looking forward to speaking with you and speaking about your book. So MT Connolly is a renowned advocate for the elderly with an impressive career dedicated to improving the lives of older adults. And I'll let her go into a few more of those details shortly. But in her book, she offers profound exploration of the challenges that come with aging, and she provides insights to her readers into how to navigate these later stages of life with dignity and with purpose. And reading the book myself, I have my copy. Excuse me, I have my copy right here. I found that I really related to a lot of what she discussed from, I grew up in the Midwest, just actually not that far from where MT grew up. I've been a caregiver for my grandparents growing up. I worked as a caregiver during law school, and I actually also interned with the Elder Justice Initiative during law school, which MT founded. So that was all really interesting for me personally. So whether you're a caregiver or planning for your own future, I think today's conversation will be enlightening for all of you. So without further ado, welcome MT again. And why don't you get us started by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and kind of what inspired you to write this book?
Well, first, thank you so much, Haley, for all of that. And thanks to you and Richard for the LTCCC. And to advocates, because I've been thinking a lot about the importance of advocacy. And it's not just the being on the front lines and trying to change things or trying to hold people accountable, but it's also translating. I was part of the webinar last week that Richard did along with the folks at Consumer Voice and Toby Edelman. And I just thought, God, the staffing, the new staffing reg is so complicated. How to advocate on it is so complicated that it's really wonderful that you guys are there trying to help us understand better, sort of the pros and cons and the nuances. So thank you. And thank you for having me. So I am a recovering lawyer. And as I was thinking about you saying that I should introduce myself, I think I'm a student of how change happens at the individual level, at the family level, at the community level, in professions, in systems, in culture, and ultimately also in our own consciousness. And that's kind of what I ended up writing about, although I didn't really know that that's what I was going to do when I started out. So I began my career, the aging part of my career at the Department of Justice, where I wound up helping to found the Elder Justice Initiative, which we initially called the Nursing Home Initiative, because it started sort of in response to a bunch of hearings that were being held in the Senate about nursing home abuse and neglect. And so the administration scrambled, this was then the Clinton administration, scrambled to have some sort of a response and created a nursing home initiative. And as I got deeper into it, I thought, oh my God, look at this new problem we've uncovered, only to learn that it was actually a very, very old problem. And that it was just one we really hadn't done much to address properly or as effectively as we might. And so then I did what lawyers do as I got deeper into it and saw that actually what happens in nursing homes is connected to what happens around aging issues more generally in society. And so then I looked at the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which was enacted in 1974, and the Violence Against Women Act, which was enacted in 1994, and thought, why is there no Elder Justice Act? And so ended up talking my way into going to the Senate. And there we worked on the Elder Justice Act. And then we had a lot of support from both sides of the aisle, which seemed very hopeful. And my co-conspirator and I were basically, as she said, choosing outfits for a signing ceremony that never happened. And it just languished and it languished. And then it was finally enacted, or a very small part of it was enacted with the Affordable Care Act in 2010, but didn't get any funding for another 5 years. And then basically just sort of rounding error in DC terms. There was a little bit of a bolus of money with the COVID money, but it's back down to just sort of trifling amounts. And so what I sort of had to acknowledge is that there's something way bigger going on when it comes to aging. And so that was really the journey with this book. And that we don't have a real cultural language to address a lot of these problems, or cultural support to address a lot of these problems. And that there are these huge cultural headwinds that we don't even really see. Things like ageism is, for many people, sort of invisible, and even, they think it's perfectly fine, or some of the other cultural norms. And so what I wanted to do is to tell the stories of people who are sort of on the front lines of making change, and to write a book about, that would be useful to not only the really sophisticated advocates who are part of this webinar, but also to people lay people. Because basically, and I'm sure it's true for a lot of people on this webinar, whenever I go to a dinner party or a brunch or whatever, people are talking about these issues. They're trying to figure out how to help their parents or their grandparents, or how to balance these really complicated issues. So in the end, I really wanted to write a book that would be helpful to people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that about your book. I've been working in the aging field now for a few years, but I found that your book was so easy to relate to for everyone, not just researchers or advocates that have been in this field. And you're right, there really isn't, at least that I know of, books kind of like that. So I really appreciated that aspect of your book. Please excuse me. I'm sorry. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm just working through that. But in your book, you mentioned the longevity paradox. What is it, and why does that matter?
In 1900, the average American lived 48 years, and by 2000, and still today, the average American lives 78 years. And so that's the lifespan, which is an extraordinary feat of science and public health and hygiene and all kinds of stuff. But we've paid way more attention to extending time than in assuring the quality of life. And so, for example, we live an average of 78 years, although the healthy life expectancy is only 66, and it's very inequitably distributed. People of color, people without educations, people of limited means carry much more health burden and have a much harder time with aging in general. Also, it means that tens of millions of people need more care than ever before. And it's something that society is largely unprepared for in terms of all the systems, and not just the care system, long-term care, but also financial systems, housing, all kinds of stuff. So I think that was something that really struck me. And, one of the things that became clear is that we want to get old, but we don't really want to be old. And so what we need to do is pay much more attention to aging. And sort of at the most basic level, I think what I was trying to say in the book is that we underestimate the power of aging. Which means that we're both unprepared for the really significant challenges, but also we're often unprepared and don't realize the gifts, the parts that matter most. And that often, because we sort of put our heads in the sand collectively as a society, largely because of ageism, that we don't really have the knowledge we need to improve the odds of having a better old age, either as individuals or in our families or as a society. So what I was trying to do, and I appreciate what you said about the book, because I didn't just want to write stories. I also wanted to connect those stories to the different systems and to give a brief primer to what some of those systems are, because they're super complicated, actually. And so to write about them in plain language was what I hope that it would just at least, it's not really a self-help book, it's not really an expose, but I wanted to basically give people better knowledge about the many different aspects of aging and sort of what a complex terrain it is.
Yeah, a couple of things came to my mind just while you were speaking about that. One is we were speaking this morning with one of our ombudsman programs, and one of them mentioned that we really are so so many people are really so unprepared for the challenges that come with these systems. They're so complex, they're so confusing. There was just a Washington Post article about this a place for mom, I think it's what it's called, is people often go to that website thinking, oh, they're going to have information for where I should put my my aging loved one, and it's really can be fraudulent. It's just really it can be really scary and really challenging. And so, I think your book is really helpful in that way. And also recognizing that we really are so lucky to age, because obviously not everyone has that that ability, or whatever it is. So we really are lucky to age, but again, it does come with challenges. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. And
On that, I think Chris Rowland, who has been doing a bunch of really good reporting for the Post on assisted living, on A Place for Mom, and a bunch of different articles, sits in the business desk. And I think that it's really important to think about both, sort of the science and health aspects of aging, but also the business aspects. And I think it's something that you guys do as well. And it was sort of a challenge in writing the book because, editors and advisors who are sort of, big strategic thinkers said, you have to choose a lane. You have to either choose the justice lane or the health lane or the services lane or, et cetera. And I'm like, I can't do it. Aging doesn't choose a lane, right? It's like life. It veers across all the different lanes, and you really have to grapple with all of those issues. And so the image that kept coming into my mind was, a lot of times when we hit aging, we're sort of in a reactive stance, and we see all these different issues tangled up in one big snarly mess. And so what I was trying to do is, sort of take all the threads and look at them individually and then braid them back together a little bit so that we can honor them both individually, but also see their roles in relationship to one another.
yeah. And yeah, we'll definitely get more into the idea of kind of the aging business, I guess, when we talk about your chapter on money. But I want to start with the first chapter of your book, and it's called Care. And I just want to know why you started with that chapter. And then I know you mentioned that you mentioned to me at least that you want to read a brief passage there about your dad. And I think our audience would love to hear that.
Thanks. So, when we're talking about the demographics, bless you, millions more people are going to need care, and we don't really know where that care is coming from. And the way I've started to think about long-term care is that it's actually a luxury item in society. And, a lot of people don't appreciate this fully as they age or their loved ones age, because Medicare doesn't cover long-term care. Most health insurance doesn't. Long-term care insurance is super expensive and often doesn't cover what you need when you need it. And a lot of people they want to age in place, which is another thing to talk about. And they're scared of the current long-term care systems because of the very real deficits. And so what does that mean? That means a lot of people either have to impoverish themselves for residential or residential care or home and community-based services and become eligible for Medicaid in order to pay for it, or they have to get care from family and friends. And AARP and various family caregiver groups have come out with varying numbers, but it's on the order of 42 to 53 million people provide a lot of care, a lot of informal, mostly unpaid care. And a lot of that care is super arduous. People are running ICUs in their living rooms. And I did that with my daughter, who was born very prematurely, basically for a couple of years. She was on oxygen for 2 years, like in a NICU for 3.5 months. So I know that is unbelievably hard work. And it's much harder if you're also trying to raise kids or hold down a job or, et cetera. So I think we really need to think more about how to help caregivers. And that work has gone largely invisible for decades, even though it helps prop up, all of our health systems and our economic systems. Ai-jen Poo writes about it as care infrastructure, that care allows the economy to run. And I think that it's important to think about it in that way. But we need to figure out better ways to support caregivers, and also to help caregivers. Families are complicated things, right? We all have one. And, sometimes we're really fortunate. I feel like I was extremely fortunate, but I also know a lot of people who have a lot of really complicated stuff in their families. And it's hard to know, we should not be foisting expectations on people. And a lot of people feel like they basically have to completely forfeit their own lives to provide care. And that's not okay either. So I think, we've got a lot of conversations to have there. And it's really universal. And fortunately, it's beginning to get more attention with, more help for caregivers, and home and community-based services was supposed to be part of Build Back Better. That didn't happen, but hopefully we're getting there. And so what I thought I would do is just start with a brief passage about my dad, just because it's like, we're all in this together, right? And especially the caregiving part. So this is the beginning of the first chapter, and it's a section called Love and Duty. Like a shift in the seasons, it's hard to pinpoint the moment when things begin to change, as time and need recast our relationships and then recast them again. But whoever we become as adults, some part of who we were with our parents shadows us if they live long enough to need our care. The role exists in a time warp, one that millions of us will at some point inhabit. The more I learned about aging, the more caregivers assumed center stage. They often determined whether older people in ebbing health flourished or came to harm. Their contributions, most unpaid or underpaid, are measured in hours and days, in years and decades. Their work is composed of countless tasks rendered from near and from afar. When he rounded 90, my father said he'd lived longer than anyone else in his family ever had. That's true in many families these days. His frailty snuck up on me. It was discombobulating. He had always been so dominant, so unyielding. He had disapproved of my choices and was shocked when I didn't bend to his wishes about religion or profession. For him, those demands were existential. Good children acceded to their parents' wishes. He hadn't counted on the provocations of raising a family in a world so different than the one he'd known. But those grueling years of conflict had long since healed over. Old age and frailty brought forth a new pacifism and sweetness in him, and in me a new tenderness for him, mingled with anticipatory grief, a little like the sensation when you first notice that the leaves have begun to fall.
It's a great passage. And I really appreciate you talking so much about the care that you provided to your dad and also to your daughter, and just thinking about caregivers. It really is so much to ask of someone, but again, it's it is kind of our duty. And it's so interesting, just the way of life of going from being cared for by your parents to then caring for your parents. It's just a really interesting way in which we live. But kind of going back to being unprepared for this, you talked about all of a sudden your dad kind of aged, and it's something that you don't, and maybe it's something that we don't really want to think about. I don't want to think of my parents as getting older and really needing care. I want to think of them as still, I don't know, maybe caring for me a little bit. I don't know if that's selfish, but it's just, you just don't want to think of your parents as I guess frail and elderly. You just don't want to think of it that way. And so you do kind of all of a sudden it happens and you are unprepared. And so just talking about like being unprepared, what are some things that you think that consumers of long-term care need to know?
Thanks for that. And just going to the other part of what you just said, and then I'll get to that question. I fell in the late fall and really messed up my leg badly. And I think I postponed being on this webinar, so thanks for that. But I really wrecked my leg, and then I had to have surgery, and I couldn't bear weight for 2 months, and I live alone. And it was like I suddenly was completely dependent. And, I had to have a recliner that launched me out. And, and my daughter literally suddenly was put in the position of caregiving for me. And I was incredibly fortunate. And those roles reversed, but it was a pretty profound experience. And I really had to buy what I was selling in this book, which I'll talk about, toward the end, maybe a little bit, but it was like, oh, I really have to get my head on straight about this, because I could spiral down, or sort of stay focused on sort of other aspects of what's going on in my life right now. So it was a very educational thing for me to take that fall. In terms of consumers of long-term care, I'm sure all of us on this webinar have been in the position where somebody comes to us and says, what should I do? About what should I do for my mom, or what should I do, blah, 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 fill in the blank. And I always wish that I had better answers. And part of it is because it's so local. And I actually think this could be a potential use for AI. If we could ask AI, what are the good facilities, or what are the good caregiving organization, care providers, what are the ratings, what are, sort of just to help us do an initial sweep, not like final research, but just to give us, because it takes so much to figure out the landscape locally, and the difference between a nursing home and a CCRC and an assisted living and a group home, and what are the payment what are the payment requirements, and when can they kick you out, and like all those things are super complicated and pretty idiosyncratic from location to location. So I think if you can afford it, a good care coordinator or manager or attorney, elder law attorney or ombudsman, somebody who knows the local landscape to help you navigate it, I think is super helpful. And that I have a story in the book about doing that with my mother-in-law, because you really need to know, oh yeah, this place looks great, but they had this horrible thing happen recently, or whatever it is, right? Like things that you can't know when you're going in and the full pressure of the sales. From a 30,000 foot level, I think we need to do much better with transparency and accountability. And I know that that's something that the advocates have been working on, but I was sort of shocked by the numbers all over again. Nursing homes and CCRCs together get more than $100 billion in public money every year. And then it's like 180 billion plus altogether, but more than 100 billion in public dollars. And we don't know how they're spending those monies. I mean, that's sort of outrageous. And this is where, being a former fraud lawyer at DOJ, we brought fraud cases. I think what we need to do much more effectively is require providers to basically certify how they're spending money. Because if you certify it, then it's actionable under the False Claims Act. So I think that is, sort of much more accountability, and that it's certified, and to move up the ladder in terms of, getting closer to the control center in terms of who has to warrant that the care that you're actually going to provide, the care that is that you say you're going to provide. Because often, there's so many layers, it's like those Matryoshka dolls, right? That it's very hard to get to the actual owners. When it comes to assisted living, as you all know, there's not really federal regulation, and not any kind of consistent standards. And they're, I think, pushing for more consumer protection cases and oversight, because both at the state and federal level, there are very powerful consumer protection laws. And basically, these are businesses making promises to people. And so holding them to the promises that they've made, and making sure that from a consumer protection perspective, it's the information is really comprehensible. I think that's That's really important too. Um, so, and I guess the one other thing I'd say is that, a couple of the people I wrote about, Allison Herschel, who many of you know, who's a legal services attorney extraordinaire in Michigan, I really talked with her, and she also has an ombudsman program, the Michigan Ombudsman program in-house at MEDGI, the Michigan Elder Justice Initiative. And so I really tried to, follow along with her, and then with Laura Mosqueda, who's a geriatrician at USC in California, who are two, real pioneers in this field, to help me understand what can consumers do to protect themselves. So I won't, go into excruciating detail here, but I think there are some things we can do, and some of it is systemic and some of it is how we, what we look for and how we proceed as consumers individually.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's really interesting. As I was thinking about the chapter on money, I was kind of taken back to my first day interning with the Elder Justice Initiative. It was after, I think it was just after my first year of law school, possibly my second. I honestly can't remember now, which is alarming. But anyway, on my first day, I remember my supervisor told me, we're going to USPS. And I thought, USPS, that seems a little bit boring, what's the connection here? And then it was all about mail fraud. And that was so interesting to me, because it was something that I guess I didn't really think about until I was, on that day. But then I kind of remembered back to my grandma being, receiving letters from, long lost relatives, or, whatever, asking for money because, they fell on hard times, or, whatever the situation was. And that aspect of aging is just so interesting to me. And so that day, I was so confused at first, but then it really all started to connect and make sense. And so I really enjoyed your chapter on money. And like you said, the nursing home industry, and there was a question submitted by one of the registrants about why and how is the nursing home industry so strong, and what is the role of the financial industry in aging?
Well, there's a lot of money, bless you. And money translates into political power, and there's a real imbalance there in terms of the money and the political power that the industry has. And as you all know, it's increasingly being gobbled up by private equity. And also, I mean, it's sort of interesting to me how the nursing home industry and assisted living and adjacent industries have joined forces so that it's one kind of juggernaut. So I think it's, it has to do with political power and constituencies. And so it's, that's, for better and for worse, that's how our system works. And it's access and power, and a lot of it's invisible. So I think, telling the stories and making sort of collective voice of really very powerless people heard is just such incredibly important work. So I think that's, that's the core of it.
Yeah. We obviously, as an advocacy organization, we are pushing a lot for, more transparency when it comes down to the money that the nursing homes received, because it is taxpayer dollars, and it should be going to the care for the residents and the staff for the residents. And, one thing that we always think about is, transparency, but also enforcement of the rules, because there are, really strong rules, especially for nursing homes. Obviously, assisted living is a different, situation, because there are no federal rules. But when it comes down to nursing homes, there are really strong rules in place that nursing homes are supposed to follow. But with, lax enforcement, that doesn't always happen. And so one of the questions submitted by one of our registrants was, why doesn't the Department of Health, which is usually, the enforcement agency, have the means to do a better job of enforcing the rules? And that kind of relates to money, I think, as well.
I mean, I think they do have, as you point out, pretty powerful tools. I mean, I actually think that tactically, one of the things that we really should be talking more about transparency and accountability, and that's not just for the industry, but it's also part of good public stewardship over public funds, and that the current situation is bad stewardship. It's, that like, in what other industry do you just like open the spigot and let the money run out and not say, how are you spending it? Because there is only one purpose for this money, right? The purpose is not to make a bunch of people rich. The purpose is to provide decent care. And we all know that staffing is integral, and also treating staff well and better is integral in that. And so, I mean, I think that is a place to apply a lot of pressure. And that there are, as you point out, I mean, and here it's different from nursing homes and assisted living, because assisted living is state by state. But at the federal level, I mean, for nursing homes, it's I think it's clearly, there are a lot of rules that can be enforced. But I think that certification would make a big difference, requiring them to certify how they're spending the money. And I really don't see any coherent argument against it. So, I mean, I know we'll hear them, but
Yes, always. Yeah, we always hear them. But yes, I agree. So I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to focusing more a bit on some specifics from your book. One thing that you talk about is balancing autonomy and safety, because obviously, we always want our aging loved ones to be safe, but it's like kind of at what risk? Like, how early do you take your keys from someone, or how early do you, maybe ask them to use a walker to, decrease the risk of falls? So can you talk a little bit more about how to kind of balance, or how to approach that issue?
Yeah, it's such an important question, I think, and we don't think about it enough. And, so I'm sure everybody is having these conversations too about, like, I've had people say, oh, well, we kidnapped my mom and, moved her to an assisted living facility closer to us. Or, having an example of an APS worker saying, well, that's just how they want to spend their money. So I think we're sort of swinging wildly between overprotection and abdication. And so we need to figure out what is the responsible way to proceed. And, just to make it real, like if someone we care about is leaving on the gas or is wandering away from home, what is our responsibility? Then also what if my uncle is giving away money to a new best friend over the phone, right? But somebody who might be the only person calling him every day. And so I think it's a really, really tricky balancing. The early studies on adult protective services showed that, like in the 60s and 70s, showed that that interventions resulted in higher rates of mortality and higher rates of institutionalization. And the theory was that it was because they overrode people's wishes. And that if you override people's wishes, often the outcomes, you think you're making them safer, but often you're not. And there's that wonderful saying, we want safety for the people we love, but autonomy for ourselves, right? So I think these are tremendously complicated ethical questions and philosophical questions. Like, for example, if I say, I never want to have another relationship after my spouse dies, and then I have another relationship, and my kids are like, well, mom said she didn't want to have a relationship, and so we're going to stop it. Like, what's the right thing? Is it what I want in the moment as cognition declines? Or is it what I wanted before? So, like, even at that kind of level, we really aren't giving people guidance, whether, bless you, whether it's family members or community members or policymakers, in terms of how to navigate these questions. The way I've started to think about it is that that what we want to do is focus on risk and who's at risk, so that if I can appreciate the decision, like if I know that I'm a fall risk and that that's okay with me, then I should be able to assume that risk. But if I'm going to put somebody else at danger, if I'm going to leave my gas on and maybe take down my apartment building, that's a risk that flows to other people, same with driving. So I think that's one way to think about risk. But I do think we need to give people much more coherent guidance and sort of honor just how complicated those questions are, because, you know, all of us, and that we should be thinking about them in advance and having conversations with the people we care about, whether it's our family or friends or the, you know, our lawyers or whoever else, our powers of attorney, to say, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, and at least think about it in advance. So, yeah, and a lot of it comes up around money, where there is, you know, where it looks like, you know, financial incapacity begins to decline often before we see any other sorts of signs of of cognitive decline. You know, there's a new study indicating that that people lose about half of their household income in the 8 years before a dementia diagnosis, which is sort of, you know, that suggests that that financial capacity, which is a different kind of thing, and we really need to be figuring out how to deal with it.
Great. There's actually a few questions that were submitted by registrants that all kind of tie into some of the things that you were just saying. So I'm just going to run through a couple of those. One person asked, as people age, why do they put off planning for their later years when they may not be able to take care of themselves?
It's such a great question. Like, why don't I eat a better diet? Why don't I exercise more? All the things, right?
Mhm.
I think it goes to ageism. You know, we have these really, I think, screwed up norms when it comes to aging, you know, and really writing about the norms, trying to understand what was going on at a societal level was very helpful to me in terms of thinking about it. You know, I mean, ageism is super powerful. If you, I mean, and it's paradoxical too, because on the one hand, older people have more economic power and more political power. But on the other hand, you know, we know old and proud is not a thing, right? Like we do not, and there's so much shame and denial, and fear and disgust wrapped up with aging, that I think it causes us to not want to look at it, either ourselves for our own lives or as a society. Like, I think it's in part helps explain why, for example, we don't really have a long-term care system. And, you know, a woman named Becca Leedy, who's at Yale, did research suggesting that people who have the most positive views of aging live on average 7.5 years longer than people who have the most negative views on aging. So it's not just frivolous, you know, like any bias, it really seeps into us and can really, I think, be detrimental to our health, including by being a barrier to better planning.
Thanks. And one of the next questions here that kind of is related is, what can I do now to ensure that my wishes are followed when I'm unable to function properly besides a power of attorney?
Oh, you know, this audience understands that powers of attorney are important, but, you know, also can be a license to steal. And it's really, I mean, I actually think from a policy perspective, one of the things we should be doing is trying to come up with instruments with proxies that address exactly this issue, because powers of attorney are basically just a private agreement between two people with no real oversight. And a guardianship is, you know, pulling out I mean, is just, you know, person loses all of their rights generally, because we don't do a very good job with sort of just targeting the very decisions that need to be targeted in terms of guardianship. So I think figuring out a way to have some sort of better accountability relating to powers of attorney and, you know, being able to plan for what we want. So I do think that there are other ways, by having conversations with your family and friends, by making sure you know who you trust, by, you know, one financial planner said, she talked about it in terms of a love letter to the family, to say, this is what I want, you know, and it's, to just make those wishes known and make sure that you have somebody you really trust to advocate on your behalf. I think is really important. And part of that is financial planning. Part of that is thinking about what kind of care and where. And here too, I think our obsession as Americans with independence and aging in place, I think can harm us too. I mean, like, I want to live in a community of people where I can be with my friends, hang out with my friends, and get the kind of help I need, but where it feels like home and community, and not like I've gone to an island where I've been forgotten. So I think we've, I mean, that's another one of the issues with the norms of aging that, was really sort of a revelation to me too, was if you think about our options as we age, essentially it's either isolation, right? We're bunkered alone in our own homes, aging in place, as it were, or we're segregated together with other older people. And that there are a lot of losses attached to both of those. And so I think we need to do a better job also creating options that serve us better.
That makes me think a lot about my grandma. My grandma is 98, and she probably could live at home if she wanted, with the help of a little bit of in-home care. But she, pretty soon after my grandpa passed away, she chose to move herself into an independent living facility because she is a really social person and she loves being around other people. So she's really lucky now to have kind of a little bit of both. So it's like she lives in an apartment on her own, but she also has the opportunity to go downstairs for coffee with all of her friends. And so I think she's in a really lucky position in that way. But that's not the reality for a lot of people. And I really like what you said about thinking of it in terms of like a love letter to your family, and just telling your family like what your wishes are. I think that's a really nice way to think about it. And thinking of kind of the financial aspect of this, one person asked, what are some of the early signs someone is struggling with comprehending the value of money?
So some of the early signs are that you're forgetting to pay your bills, or you're suddenly giving away money. My dad said, I know I'm more vulnerable, and so I don't, I just put down the phone when people start asking me for money. But he still got a lot of mail, and the people who wrote to him, he gave, he wrote small checks, but he did write checks. And so I think it's also, understanding that you're going to be targeted. I mean, we're all going to be targeted, but older people are going to be targeted way disproportionately. And was the question how to protect ourselves? I'm sorry.
No, that's no problem. It was just, what are some of the early signs? So I think
the early signs.
Yeah.
So I think, there's some research suggesting that we get less suspicious of what are inherently suspicious circumstances, which is sort of a double-edged sword too. It's one of the reasons that a lot of people are happier in their, as they grow older, because they see the positive in life and, are less likely to be negative. And so, there are a lot of trade-offs here. But there are, if suddenly the financial practices totally change, a new best friend over the phone to whom you're sending money, all those kinds of things are, can be problematic. One of the programs I wrote about that I was really kind of inspired by was a program called Money Minders, which is in Maine, started by the AAA there, where they have bonded volunteers who are, retired accountants and attorneys and people like that, who help older people who want some help with financial management. And, that can be very expensive. And so this is free. And, people who have fewer means need help managing those means even more to make them last, not just to retirement, but through retirement. And so I think that's a really great model in terms of sort of a kind of prevention where you get, you have help available to you in terms of financial planning. And so that, whether it's a family member or you yourself, are aware of, potential risks.
Yeah. One of the main themes I think in your book and in the questions that we received from registrants today is about ageism. I'm going to kind of just combine some of those questions and what do you think is the best way to approach or to address ageism? And do you see changes in the awareness of ageism in our society?
Well, going to the second part of the question first, I think for sure there's more awareness about ageism given the ongoing election cycle. I'm not sure a lot, it's a little daunting for those of us who care about ageism and or want to fight against it, because there's a lot of, sort of vicious ageism in the world right now. And I think people feel a lot of permission because it's for all kinds of complicated reasons, including that it's just our future selves. I think we need to really get our heads on straight about aging and think about it, as you said earlier, as an opportunity, and to really think about the gift of time. Like, there is nothing more precious than the gift of time. We get to be alive. And so I think that there are ways to think about it, in terms of ourselves, and then also to advocate more. I mean, there are also, I also think that ageism leads to more elder abuse, because essentially what you're doing is dehumanizing people. Any kind of bias kind of justifies or is the excuse for worse treatment, because you're essentially dehumanizing a person, right? You're not recognizing the fullness of their humanity. And so, so I think that we really need to think about what the consequences are, because we tend to think that there's not much downside to ageism, and I think that's not true. There's not only the health consequence and some suggestion that it increases, violence and mistreatment, but also it's really expensive. I mean, that same study that Becca Levy did suggests that it's like $63 billion in unnecessary expenses to the health system. So I think we need to stop thinking about it as a victimless form of bias and to really think about how to address it. Also just in our families and communities, because there's a lot of opportunity, because we hear a lot of it and it's super insidious.
Yes. Yeah, we do hear a lot of it, especially like you said, with the current election going on. So I want to move on. We're just in the last few minutes of our program. So I want to move on. There's a couple questions in the Q&A, and then I just have a couple of slides that I want to wrap up with. And then my last question to you is just kind of going to be, the takeaways of your book. But let's hit the Q&A first. So the first question here is from Liz Stern. She says, if there is time, I would appreciate anything MT can add to her chapters on moving legislation. Many of us on the call are involved in passing the bicameral Bipartisan Essential Caregiver Act, which was recently introduced. Specifically, after introduction, what is the most impactful strategies MT can suggest?
Well, as you might, I have one chapter called Law about the Elder Justice Act as sort of a case study, and then one called Movement, basically trying to do a forensic analysis of what went wrong in terms of our advocacy. And so I think that there are, that's a huge and really important question, but I think, we need to have voices, and that, I mean, I take hope. I mean, there's a lot more talk about caregiving right now than there has been. So voices, organizations, we really need powerful organizations that have the clout to really have an impact with the people who are at the levers of enacting or passing legislation. We need a lot of tools. There's money, but there's also, having public affairs, understanding who to pressure for what. There's communications, I think we have not been very good communicators in this field. And I mean, I think I'll just take it on myself. I have not been a great communicator in many circumstances. So we need to learn how to do that. And we have to hold our public officials responsible. We have to make it more painful for them to not act than to act. And we haven't been able to do that. And these issues have, they've been able to skate on these issues. And basically, the aging issues are Medicare, Social Security, retirement funds. And we really need to say, no, those are super important, but there's also a much fuller tableau of issues that are important to being able to age well and to ourselves and with our loved ones that you have to be responsible for.
Thanks. Yeah, we talk about, just the issue of aging not being, a sexy issue, and just really getting people to care seems so difficult at times. And so I think that's, so yeah, thanks for all of that. That's really helpful. And then the next question is from Michelle. What do you think of the small skilled nursing home movement? Will Congress ever provide funding for it, even if it's just a demonstration program?
I think it's great if you're talking about like greenhouses and stuff like that. And I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think the thing about nursing homes is we know how to do it and we know how to do it right. We just aren't doing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then the last question here in the Q&A, might we run nursing homes as we do public education? I realize this is highly simplified, but I believe this may be begin the conversation, Ray elder care.
Yes, and we haven't done that great in public education either. So I'm a veteran of the DC public school system, or my kids are, and I love public education. I think it's super important. I think we need to have a really high level sort of Manhattan Project kind of conversation about how to redo our long-term care system. And I think there are other countries that have done a good job. We're often loath to ask how other countries do things, but I think there's a lot to learn there in terms of better models.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so that's all we have in the Q&A. I am going to share my screen again just quickly. I have a few closing slides for today.
So Haley,
so again,
can I make one other really quick point? Because
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Just because I think it's super important in terms of sort of one of the things that was most surprising to me, and this was actually one of the questions that was submitted in advance in terms of like how to age better, is to focus more of our attention on what matters most and on meaning making. And I was really surprised that there were like very concrete ways to do that. So in staying connected with people, in having purposeful activity in our lives, in sort of paying attention to curiosity and creativity, in cultivating awe, like the eclipse in the night sky and stuff like that is shown to really improve our well-being. And then in storytelling, which is really important, like we are storytelling humans, and it is important both for us individually in relationship and also as advocates. So there's a whole chapter on it, but I think it was for me the most important thing that I learned.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. And after the slides, I'll allow you a little bit more time if you want, just to kind of close up. And I know you have a little passage from the book that you'd like to read as well. So I'm just going to go through these slides really quick. So again, we are on Instagram. Please give us a follow if you're also on Instagram. And then please sign up for our June webinar. We are going to be discussing the impacting inclusion for LGBTQ plus elders, the long-term care equality index. And we have a speaker, Dan Stewart. He's the Deputy Director of the Aging Equality Project for the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. And this program will be on the third Tuesday of June, June 18th, and as always at 1 p.m. And you can register at the link below there. And I'll also ask Richard to put that link in the chat if you can. Thanks. And then lastly, you can head to Nursing Home 411. Today's materials from today's webinar will be up by the end of the week, the video and all of that, and I'll link to MT's book as well. Again, register for our June webinar and follow us on Instagram. And you can always visit LTCCC's Learning Center. We have fact sheets that we're always, by the way, adding to and updating. So be sure to check those out. We have assisted living guides, family empowerment resources, And actually this Thursday, we have our next family empowerment program. So please do join us for that. And then we also on Nursing Home 411, we have the Resident Abuse, Neglect, and Crime Reporting Center, which I think has a lot of really great resources. So be sure to check that out. And then lastly, this is for Ombudsman. We will send you an email confirming your attendance of this program. So just watch out for that. And I am going to stop sharing my screen now. And I will let MT just close us off with a passage from her book. And again, MT, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and for writing this book. It really is so it's going to have such a huge impact on people, and I think it's really enlightening and touches on so many topics. I was really surprised about that reading the book. You touch on so many topics and in such a way that's really digestible. So I appreciate that. So yeah, if you want to just close us out today with the passage from your book, that would be great.
Well, thanks so much for having me and, for everything that you guys do and everyone on this webinar does. We need it all. So this is from the epilogue of the book. So it's the very end. When my 7 siblings and I gathered to clean out our father's apartment after he died, we found a letter in his desk, still in draft. "This is a letter of thanks for your loving care," it began. "He and my mother," he said, "were grateful that my brothers hadn't been called to war, disappointed that we weren't better Catholics, happy we got along well, and pleased that we were all reasonably good looking, healthy in mind and body, and of above average intelligence." He'd started off writing in black ink and then switched to blue, writing on both sides of the thin paper, ever frugal. Along the torn top edge hung a few decapitated lower loops of letters. But there was no ending. He was pondering another idea. At the bottom of the page, he'd written "consolation for me in recent years," and in teal marker in all caps, "2 consolations." That was it. Words left mid-thought. I carried the word and the feeling of the word around me, part haunting, part memento. What were those consolations? It's a big, generous word, capable of holding dark and light, binding together suffering and comfort, a little like aging. Loss encroaches, but we're alive. My father, his body declining and death drawing near, found consolation in the loving care he received and in the meaning he drew from life. Those consolations then rippled on through time from him to us, taking on new life, becoming new consolations. A legacy of peace, not regret, a type of grace. Everywhere, everyone is aging. Everywhere, someone loves someone who is growing old. Everywhere, decent people do their best or want to do their best with too little help. Wonder how to do it right. Wonder if someone will do right by them. Wonder how not to be broken by it all. Wonder if they will find the consolations of loving care and meaning. We can't stop aging, but we could do so much more to stop the needless suffering that attends it. Some things are simple, others are hard. But if we bring the same ingenuity, will, and hope we've invested in lengthening life to improving it, much is possible. Common consolations, a deeper, more lasting justice. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, MT. And thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned, the link to the program will be up later this week, and I'll also link to MT's book. And I really encourage you to buy it and read it. I think it's really, really enlightening for everyone. So be sure to check it out. And again, MT, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks all. Bye.
Bye.